2 days ago, I got a pain in my knee for the first time ever, so I limped a little bit, dealing with that. As Lee said, I graduated in '63, a year earlier, and then we taught for several years here in the high school. And then I heard her say that I'd like to go home. She was born in East Africa, and so we applied to Mennonite Civic Committee for a position with the TAP program. But somewhere along the way, the Mennonite Civic Committee sold us to to Eastern Board, a mission board. And I was then seconded to the Christian Council of Tanzania. And at that time, the Christian councils were the national Christian councils were just developing. They were successors to what had been called missionary fellowships. These fellowships had been organized by missionary organizations, Western missionary organizations, to facilitate Bible translation, education, and health services. And then when we landed in 1965, the process of shifting leadership from missionaries to Africans was underway all across the board. And it was a very, very dramatic time because not only was this happening within the church, but similar things were happening in the political scene as well. So you had armed resistance in some places. Some countries were moving toward independence very quickly. When we arrived, about half of what are now African nation states had declared independence. But the southern half of the continent was still struggling. South Africa, the Portuguese, not colonies, they were departments at that time. And those were really very, very difficult. Later, I was seconded to the Christian Council of Sudan, and then after that, National Council of Churches in Kenya, and later to the All Africa Conference of Churches in Nairobi. Now that was a continental organization. These were all Protestant ecumenical organizations at a time when we in the Mennonite Mission Board were not using words like ecumenical, because that word was associated with the World Council of Churches, and that was not seen to be something one wanted to use as in normal language. So the several assignments that I had, well, by the way, I was loaned as a fraternal worker. I was not loaned as an expert of any kind. I was a neophyte in every assignment. And my learning curve was basically straight up all the time. Because my bosses were always Africans, and I was told what to do, and I was expected what to do. And I was often introduced saying, well, this guy is here, but he's doing what we're telling him to do, and he's leaving, so don't worry about him. He's not a threat to anybody. Whereas the missionaries were invited to leave, and so on. In that process, I was exposed to a variety of expectations as to what change meant. The primary change that was underway at that time was, of course, from the colonial story. And by the way, all of Africa was under European colonial rule, except for two countries, Liberia and Ethiopia. Everyone else, all the other countries, now 55 nation states, were under European domination. And something similar happened in the churches. When the process there took place, you had various dynamics underway. How do you make changes? Well, one of the forces that was at work in the churches at that time was what they called African instituted churches. These were churches organized by Africans in resistance against the missionary churches, missionary founded churches. So that was one kind of resistance in this change process. The other one was the East Africa revival, which began in the 1920s and eventually influenced missionaries all over East Africa, including Mennonite missionaries who were very deeply involved in that process. And that allowed for a careful shift of leadership from missionaries to Africans. Then the assignments I had were largely secular. I mean, I was involved in rural development. I was involved with the All Africa Conference of Churches, in the Foreign Affairs Department. So these were very practical, sometimes political engagement. And during that time, with the All Africa Conference of Churches, the Rwanda genocide took place. And we were directly involved in that whole process. And also during that whole time, we had Desmond Tutu as our chair of the All Africa Conference of Churches. So we were plugged in as well to the resistance movement in South Africa, to the anti-apartheid situation. So these were very dynamic bits. And as a result, or accompanying that process, were also theological undertakings. And I was hugely intrigued how African theologians worked at that. How do you do change, and where do you find inspiration for change? And I was constantly amazed that they usually started with their own African traditional experience and said, this is who we are. And sure enough, some of these experiences, some of these understandings of who we are found also in the Bible. And therefore we can say the Bible is true because we are true. And many things took off from there. In terms of, and I was involved very deeply in the development scene. Let me just point out that in 1948, the United Nations was founded, as we know, after the Second World War. Between 1972 and 1982, there were 18 global UN conferences discussing all kinds of issues like water, like food, like health, and many other issues. That was when the world was told what the acceptable standards are to aspire to. And in a sense, those standards declared much of the world poor at that point. Because we set these standards to say, well, if you're not there, that means you're somewhere in the poverty scale. I was always impressed that when we talked about development, we of course invoked Western standards. We very rarely began with the strengths of local societies. And in all the years I was there, I only came across one international organization, the International Center for Research on Agroforestry, based in Nairobi. When they began, they took a survey of inventory around the world and asked the question, what are people doing well in the different situations? Why have they survived so well? What have they done right in the process? And on that basis, they set up an international program. But that was fairly rare, and certainly among church-related development people, that was also very rare. Just assumed that we were telling them what to do. We had many deliverables, but not very many receivables, or discussables, as it were. So that always bothered me, and I interacted quite a bit with pastoral people in northern Kenya. These people were many of them were Cushites, and you could very quickly identify some of their ideas with biblical notions. For example, in 1981, I discovered a situation where people were celebrating something very, very close to the biblical jubilee of Leviticus 25, almost word for word, and other examples like that. So you could, and don't forget that Moses' wife was a Cushite, and Moses was taught by his father-in-law about God, and there were those relationships between the Cushites and the Jews. I was struck by that wisdom that was coming at me all the time. There were other bits as well that struck me. How do we discover truth? What is the nature of truth? My wife has a collection of about 100,000 African proverbs in about 70 different categories. And along the way, there was an institute developed in South Africa to study proverbs. And by the way, the word is parameology, the study of proverbs. And she's a parameographer, if you like those kinds of words. One of the fellows involved was Stan Nussbaum. He may be a name to some of you. I think he was associated with Bluffton College for a while. And that project had as their chair John Mbiti from Kenya, a very prominent theologian. So they studied the phenomenon of African proverbs and came up with several interesting insights, one of which struck me profoundly. And I witnessed this again and again. Very often in a meeting, we would have vigorous discussions, and then some wise guy in the back would come up with a proverb and clinch the whole discussion. That's how it is. Bang. Got it right. That's what we said, that's what we agreed. And then another wise guy would come with a proverb and say the exact opposite. And that is where truth resides. That's where things move forward. And I just experienced that again and again, and began to understand that the way forward in any discussion is to stay within shouting distance of contradictions. Keep the contradictions alive. Don't get lost in a linear whatever. And in any case, the other thing I discovered was that whereas in the West we assume that knowledge is linear, moves in a line toward the future, toward some apocalypse, toward some conclusion, John Mbiti in Africa said time goes the other way. It goes from the present to the past and accumulates around wise people. And you can access that knowledge, wise people access that knowledge for whatever purposes we have now. It doesn't always say the same thing. It depends what your needs are here. So that wisdom is there, but it's malleable wisdom. And that was the nature of wisdom, the nature also of it. I saw influence even biblical understandings. Let's see what this passage says, but let's also see what our need is at the moment, and then we'll decide what that means. And that happened just again and again. So I mentioned these bits because those were the kinds of assaults that I felt all the time, rebuking my understandings and learnings. And I think I can say it continued all the way through. We stayed 50 years, yes, but I think partly because we were slow learners, I had to try to catch on what was happening, and I also became besotted. I found the traditions and the debates very, very interesting. Okay. Then last year we came here, and somehow I had assumed that I would know what's going on here. I assumed that we left at 65, and I come last year, and I assumed we'll just plug in. Well, sure enough, we have a department down here near Food Lion, And one of the things that we talk about all the time is how everything works. You know, our gas is there, our water is there, electricity is there, everything works, and we don't, and it's all paid for through the bank, and we can just sit there and enjoy. It was said in Nairobi that if you see someone driving in a straight line, you better be careful, that person is probably drunk. The person the sober driver is probably, avoiding potholes. So, well, and there's another story about a Kenyan who went to Sweden for whatever reason and rented a car and was driving some hours in Sweden and developed a terrible headache and tried to analyze why this headache. Well, couldn't see any potholes. Was disturbed by that. I haven't seen any potholes here, and I tried to deal with that. Is this normal? I'm asking myself, is this the way we're supposed to live? Okay, so then shortly after arrival, Lee Yoder and a few other people invited me to join ACRS. And ACRS had just begun to talk about sustainability as a theme, sustainability, and had suggested that there be a little committee on sustainability. So I was asked to chair that meeting, or that committee. And I knew nothing about this place, so I decided to do a quick survey. And so for some weeks and months, I went around here and checked out what I would easily call green initiatives, and immediately found something like 30 or more. I was astonished by what I found. The creativity that I discovered here just blew me away. Individuals doing all kinds of interesting things. Then I began to see a pattern. So I asked myself, what motivates these people? Well, one motivation came right out of Eastern Mennonite University here. Many of the people that I talked to had come through Eastern Mennonite University and had been influenced, and they would talk about this professor or that class or that book that I read there influenced me and took me in a particular path. Very interesting. So after a while I could see a bit of a pattern. One person who struck me one discovery had to do with a personality here in the valley, and the name is Louis Heatwell. I have not quite recovered from that discovery. Louis Heatwell was a Mennonite bishop living here in Dale Enterprise, and in 1868 he began to keep records of rainfall in this valley. He was a weatherman, had weather monitoring as a hobby. Kept records all the way through, and eventually advised Harrisburg City, eventually the state of Virginia, eventually Washington, and eventually the League of Nations on how you do weather stations. This was in the 1920s. So just recently, we were beginning to pay attention to weather in this valley. He also paid attention to geomorphology in this valley. He was interested in that. He was careful with his own knowledge, and he got a master's degree somewhere along the way, but he kept it hidden pretty much. At that time, these mountains around here were all clear-cut. Lumber mining had destroyed these mountains. And meanwhile, if you drive around here now, these mountains are all tree-covered. And I keep wondering what we might find if we look carefully at the rainfall records as these mountains were reforested. I'm looking for a person who's going to look at that. So this person, Louis Heatwell, I think we must consider as a valley ancestor who who looked at this place with very unique eyes and left us with interesting questions to look at. I found so many different things. One of them was the farmer's market down here. You're all familiar with the farmer's market. And just the other day I listened to a lecture by the architect who designed that, but I also talked to the people who dreamt up that project, Margaret and Samuel Johnson. They spent years fussing about that, thinking about the sacrifice, in fact, living from hand to mouth until they finally got that thing going. Today, there's something like 70 or more vendors in that farmer's market, and a whole body of insight and activity, economic activity, and expertise has developed around that farmer's market. And you could go on and on in different directions. The other biggie that I discovered, of course, was the solar panel thing. This is a really big one. And I'm discovering all the time the many actors in that field. Cal Reddecup is one of the people right here. And there are many others. The question that came to me along the way was, what happens if you draw a circle, some kind of a circle around all these activities? Does that have a name? Is that the future? Is that looking toward the past with nostalgia? What is this thing that's happening? What happens when you discuss it and analyze this sort of thing? Should that be stimulated somehow? In the process, I also talked with our friend Lauren Swartzberg, and he told me about the process that was underway here at EMU in around 2010, as they were seeking re-accreditation in the Association of Colleges and Universities in this region. A very intense process that produced a little booklet that brought together all the findings and the understandings. That booklet, in my opinion, is something of a classic. It should be very public, I think, because it pursues the arguments looking for values, looking for implementation, and influencing a large audience. And at the time, I was told by Lauren that there were hardly any other colleges in Virginia that were asking those kinds of questions at that time, and only 2 or 3 in the whole association that were concerned about sustainability and green initiatives. So here we are with incredible creativity. I noticed that there are many individuals out there doing creative things, very much on their own. I've been looking also for forums where these things are discussed, and I have not found them very readily. Just a quickie back to Kenya, Northeast Africa. When we fussed about an innovation in Africa, we were looking for the social go-to place. Where is that? Where do we discuss innovation? Okay, there may be an individual out there taking some initiative, but that individual has to be very careful. Don't be too innovative and don't go too far ahead. You just might be chopped down. You might be seen as some kind of a evil spirit because you're going too far in one direction. So a really good leader with a really good idea had to be careful to take as many people on board as possible and to think of a change process as increment as small as possible so that everyone could agree. Don't take a big leap. So for example, I was involved with what they called sand dams. This began in the late 1970s. Today there are some thousands of these sand dams, but in the early days, one of the innovators, one of the leaders was saying, let's go easy on this. Let's go very slowly. No mechanics, no moving parts, no nothing. Just very simple stuff, so that everyone can go together and we don't lose each other. And that was a very strong initiative, a strong ethos. Here, I'm sensing almost the exact opposite. Very strong people taking initiatives, becoming very preoccupied with what they're doing and doing it very, very well. But then I ask, where is the general discussion? And is it fair to be led by technology, or does our discussion, our concern, lead technology? Tell us where to go. We're discussing those kinds of things even now. And is there a place within ACRS for that kind of discussion where the ethics of technology and the choices that we make and the community dynamics are considered in a group or in a social process? So just to conclude, I'm struck by the incredible role that EMU has played over the years. I'm also struck that we're not hearing very much on this subject from church at this point. That is striking to me. And just recently, someone, the editor of the Mennonite World Review, Paul Schrag, had an editorial, and he mentioned that both Russian and Swiss Mennonites, when they came to North America, pretty much bought into the frontier mentality. We are assuming that there's more land, especially if you go west, there's more land, and it's for us, and we should have access to that. The idea that take it a bit easy, be careful that you don't take too much, wasn't quite, he was saying, wasn't quite there. Now, just yesterday, I was listening to CNN, and there was a report yesterday from the United Nations, a global assessment report on biodiversity and ecosystem services. It was making several major comments. One of them was that in a typical human lifetime, our lifetime now, approximately 1 million species are disappearing. I don't know, we can get our head around that sort of thing. Nature, according to this report, is in trouble, and therefore we are in trouble. They're saying that while I'm enjoying my little apartment back here where everything works, and I see no potholes, right? That's happening at the same time. There's overwhelming evidence that human activities are behind nature's decline, according to that report. So those are several assertions. But the other thing that really intrigued me and reinforced some of my learnings from East Africa was that now we need to be looking at the wisdom of indigenous people. A lot of wisdom is lodged there. Let's go and ask them what's going on, what they did right, and how they survived where they are. And I experienced a little bit of that just before we left Kenya. One of the lady researcher with the International Council of Research on Agroforestry, had worked here for some time and then left and is now here in the States. Her name is Joan Baxter. And she is now revisiting Africa on her own. And she's visiting minority peoples, minority communities. And she's finding food, all kinds of grains and food varieties and insects and all sorts of things that were not discovered by the development process and not disturbed by the development process. And she's finding these to be resources to be looked at afresh. So that may be part of the future. Thank you very much.
not worry about being first, just do it. Yes, Tom?
Well, Harold, I'm pleased to be in your network of friends. And today reminds me again of one of the hallmarks of your character and personality that was told to me and preceded our meeting, meeting you with folks that came to learn alongside you, expats that learned alongside you in Annetta, that was substantive to their life work and ethics in land and community, which is the nature of humility through listening and learning. That speaks to an ethic that I think I'm hearing through my lens and biases of what you're discovering with the folks that are inspiring you here, of coming back 50 years later and discovering a number of generations of folks who have sought to listen and be attentive to how they're living in the world, what they have been inspired, however the gospel reached their ears, the pursuit of making amends with maybe reading the gospel wrong at some point, and trying to do different, live life differently. You speak of Samuel and Margaret. You speak of folks engaged in the farmer's market. What's my point here? It's the observation of individuals being inspired by whatever touchstones they might experience, synthesizing that in their own way, and just trying to humbly, confessionally, just step out, live, and lead. Can you package that in some Promethean, Protestant, institutional organizing ethic and still succeed with the innovation, the creativity, the passion, and the goodness of that? I'm not sure. Can you, I think a better term is, can you scale it up and not lose that innovation? I'm not sure. I'll be brief here. What we read is often the food that shapes us. You asked about the role of the church. I didn't grow up in a creation care congregation. I grew up in a capitalist Anabaptist congregation where no Amishman was above making money. And we read an eschatological linear history that we're marching towards Jesus, creation be damned. And those are things we have to reckon with. My observations.
Well, just a quickie. One other impression that came again and again was that, well, by the way, there are something like 2,000 people groups in Africa. Each one, their language, traditions, foods, and importantly, place. Until recently, you could generally identify people groups in place. And the other significant thing about that was that language and understandings and wisdom were informed by place. So the weather, the soil, the plants, and so on had formed language, and people knew how to interact with those bits in order to survive. So integrity meant taking account of what is there. We are all immigrants. And when we came here, we brought from Europe our farming systems. Our farming systems are not based on, we brought the crops even from Europe. We didn't start from here. So we have some disadvantages in our beginnings in how we shape our loyalties and our awarenesses. And that's a problem. And we need to somehow take that into account.
Okay. Other questions, comments, observations, amens, or anything else? Harold, you might want to comment on these 8 basic recommendations that you brought your subcommittee. By the way, tell them who's on your sustainability subcommittee, the group that you're working with, and these were the 8 items that were brought to the steering committee. Tell us a little bit about those.
Okay, the subcommittee is made up of Kenton Brubaker and Doug Rayburn Neufeld, Earl Martin, Wayne Teal, and myself. Well, I chose these 8 arbitrarily from the longer list that I mentioned earlier. And they include a further pursuit of and consideration of the contribution made by Louis Equal as sort of an ancestor comment, looking and revisiting carefully the EMU initiative and what that means, and also looking at what does a secular institution like JMU say and do with regard to sustainability. Looking at solar panels, and I mentioned that earlier. The other one is Park Woods down here. There's a very intense process going on in debating the future and the utility of Park Woods. And then I mentioned also earlier the farmers market and the related Dayton produce market. Very interesting innovations. The whole idea of working toward green policy, what does that look like? And then looking at the prevailing academic, scientific, theological, and societal understandings of ideas like sustainability. I just should mention here, I did mention the Cal Redicup's book of the year 2000. And Kenton Brubaker wrote an article for some encyclopedia way back on the environment, so we have bits and pieces. When you read the compendium that Cal put together, the discussion was scattered. There was not quite uniformity in terms of where we come from when we debate this sort of thing. So we have that. We have what I mentioned earlier, Schrag's comment in the middle of the review. Way out somewhere to the left, we also have Pope Francis' encyclical called Laudato Si. I wish that some Mennonite would have written that rather than the Pope. It's very good, but it's also quite radical. He makes the case that we don't have the option of deciding that we will take care of creation. We taking care of creation. We are molecules in creation. Our decision making, our choices, our behavior, or whatever, is already a choice and already a comment. We are a part of that whole thing. And we need to be self-aware as we go. Now, the Pope's encyclical has just gone all over the place. Governments, UN, everywhere. And it needs to be looked at. So it seems to me that in terms of the theology of sustainability, of creation, needs a lot of discussion. It needs to be a constant concern of ours, given the findings of UN and many others.
Next comment, question, observation. Right here. Yeah. Richard Bowman.
In looking at your committee, I was just, and also thinking of the history of the farmers market. I don't know if you run across Rodell Schrock or not,
Yeah.
but at least I was just thinking of him because he would be a practitioner, so we say. He would be a farmer, a truck farmer kind of thing, that would balance maybe some of the just plain academic concerns. I just raised that as an issue.
Thank you.
Good, back here, Earl Martin.
I'm not sure I heard everything. You said that you referred here to the Pope's seems to me that maybe the closest thing we have as Mennonites to the Pope's encyclical is a study that I believe was led by Lauren at EMU.
Yeah.
But it seems to me it's a candle under a bushel. I'm wondering if there'd be some way we could commission Lauren and others to take that work and expand it to Mennonite Church USA and adapt it for Mennonite Church USA, and with maybe a little more popular edge to it, popularized, accessible edge to it. But it seems to me that that's a tremendous resource that needs to be expanded throughout the Mennonite Church.
Agreed.
All right. Yes, Calvin, one of our founding fathers in this whole topic.
Thanks for that unexpected compliment. I guess you would expect me to say something, or whatever, because I really appreciate what you've been telling us, Harold, in terms of a historical and intercultural analysis. It's wonderful to hear. I'm basically, I think, in line with what you're saying, but I'll make two comments. One major orientation at the University of Chicago was the demographic transition, which said that all these things will be solved in a certain amount of time. The issue is population, and I'll stop with that, because that's one of the concerns that is hardly ever mentioned. And when we talk about human activity and human intervention in nature, we're talking about population. We're talking about people. And so the Mennonite Church and the Church at large simply ignores the issue of overpopulation. Now, I have a second comment, and that is that I appreciate your support or your promotion that it is the gradualism that works for cultural and social change. And in a sense, that's exactly right. You get your head chopped off if you're too aggressive and so forth. On the other hand, you have to look at the context. And the context for gradualism means there's an unlimited amount of time left. Scientists are now telling us that it may be only 10 or a dozen years before we have reached the point of no return, where nature will never recover what it has been. And so we'll have to adjust to a new concept of creation. So how does that issue of the urgency of the present situation deal with this wonderful concept of the community where everybody has to go along with it at a certain pace or it won't work? And in a sense, the contradictory to your proposal or your description is L.J. Hinkle himself. He was an individual, a very interesting and creative one. And another comment from the back of the University of Chicago, a major research was done. Where does innovation and change come from? And almost invariably, when these researchers would go from here to there, they discovered finally that they could trace any specific change to an individual somewhere. Now, that's an interesting concept. And I'm just saying that this is a very complicated issue, and I'm ready to throw the discussion here, but this is just the beginning, and more could be said. Amen.
Now there's some other hands over here, Ruth.
I wanted to pick up on somewhere around point 7 or 8 in the 8 that you listed. I think I heard a reference to policy, and also to pick up on some of Cal's remark about urgency. I have the experience of feeling that I'm in a situation where a tsunami is coming, and we're doing a lot of thinking, theological and historical and personal and so on about it, when in fact, filling up sandbags isn't actually the only option or something like that. in some situations. Maybe not for a tsunami, so I'm mixing up my example here, but you know what I mean. And the problem I have is that we don't have the time to do well a lot of the things we should be doing about the situation we're in. And in fact, what I'm hoping from the sustainability efforts that EMU is doing is the mobilization of a lot of people, starting where we are means a lot of Mennonites, for much more immediate, urgent political action. It shouldn't be that Mark Obenshain can be the state senator in our area and be considered a respectable, laudable Christian person. This county is full of respectable, wonderful, committed, helpful, community-minded, Republican Christian people. And there's no connection being made locally. Ben Klein reports in his email, which I'm somehow on the list to get, about his wonderful meeting down in the Gulf with people who are wanting to do oil drilling, and they were taking, I'm sure at their expense, they were taking our political representatives there and showing them how safe and safe for the environment this drilling will be. And he's reporting on that, and these people who get their money from Dominion, whether they're Republicans or Democrats. But these are decisions that the decisions these people are making, and of course the judges who are going to back up corporate entities wherever and whenever. It's really urgent and immediate, and so part of what I feel is that there are a lot of really wonderful ideas and reflections and broad thinking and so on that should be enlightening us by now, and maybe should have starting 30 or 40 years ago. But that really at this point, I'm not seeing people who, including myself, who are acting like it is in fact urgent, and the ability for us to even have the option to do some things well is blocked right now by a very specific political forces. And we are not on top of that. And if we're not, we're wiping out the possibilities for a lot of other wonderful things that we love to think we are all about. So I have a feeling of panic. I live with a feeling of virtual panic every day. And I don't know where to turn. I mean, there are a lot of organizations doing things, and I try to support them. I try to do a few things that I feel like I can do locally, and I'm cheering for a lot of other things that I see. But we are not at the level of action that the appropriate panic should be leading us to be at. I don't see it happening. Even in this room, I don't think it's happening enough within myself. And I just wanted to air that. I'm terribly excited about the things that I see that are coming up. They are nowhere near the level that we need to be at. So I don't have an answer. I'm glad if you can give some comment or response.
Well, I'm following some of the comments and attitudes of your president as well. Your president, our president. He's not exactly in tune with what we're talking about here either. I have wondered why we don't just all rise up and walk to Washington and stay there until something dramatic changes. I don't know how that would work. The women tried it. And I don't know what we do with urgencies. Like I said, we are far too comfortable in our little apartment over here. Everything works. I have no problems with my life on a day-to-day basis. Whereas in Nairobi, I was always, something didn't work, and I was always spending a day or two on very small bits and pieces. So we become very complacent. I agree. And one of the questions that we raise here is, where does a discussion naturally take place? Is it within institutions? Is it within communities? Is it, ACRS says we're a little bit above institutions. We have dotted line relationships, but we're not tied with black lines with institutions. We're not responsible. We're thinking, is that a good place to be? Or is that a space within which we can begin to talk urgent things. This is an ongoing bit. And by the way, it seems to me that even the word sustainability needs to be interrogated. Imagine we talk about flourishing. What would it take to flourish, to work with our environment such that it actually grows and is enhanced? One of the recommendations, by the way, of this UN report is that approximately half of the world needs to be set aside for rehabilitation right now, if we are to survive on this earth.
Okay, other questions? One word I heard out of Washington not long ago was the fact that since it's getting so much warmer and the snow and ice is melting over the North Pole area of the Arctic, that this might be opening some new trade routes.
Exactly. All the oil up there as well.
It's always fun to hear you, Harold. Carolyn and I had the great honor of being in Kenya 3 of their 50-plus years. And they were a source of rootedness and groundedness. And, and I've never forgotten that. They made my work a lot easier because of their connections. They called me, oh, a man of peace. Well, where does that come from? Well, that's from all people know Carolyn and Netta. Second thing is, if you're intrigued by the first part of Harold's comments about the sort of the Mennonite involvement and mission era in East Africa, Harold has a couple of books you can find on Amazon. One sort of personal stories, which is very interesting. Another is reflections on, well, it's called Reflections on Africa. In Africa. There's a difference, isn't there, Annetta? Yeah, I thought about that when I was looking at the title. But that's really fascinating too. It's a history that we can learn a lot from, basically. The third thing I guess I wanted to say is, I think, in picking up on some other comments, I think you capture well the Mennonite aura of thinking small. That's not what I want to say. My critique of Mennonites is that we think too small. And I think the issue of sustainability reflects that really well. It's nice that individuals do this. It's nice that we all put solar panels on our house, which many of us do here. But as Bill McKibben says, that's not going to cut the mustard. There's not time to do that. So we need to be at the table of global agreements, not just have our little projects here and there. Again, which are important, but there is not time to do that. We need global climate agreements. And how do we do that? Well, we can advocate, we can vote for people who make those decisions in national and state and local elected positions. How do you deal with this Mennonite thing of thinking small, where the problem is really huge, kind of like Ruth was saying?
Well, one of the, if you think about our present, this thing, one of the things you think about in our circles is about the Mennonite World Conference. And recently someone did an articulation of Mennonite, of Anabaptist global theology, how we think as Anabaptists globally. That is one way to go, but I find myself somewhat critical of that. And the reason being that different situations require different theologies. And what we're really talking about are faithfulnesses in different situations. If you're living in Greenland, your ethics by which you live are not exactly the same as they are in the Amazon forest, right? There are different things at work, different kinds of awarenesses and faithfulnesses. So that's one bit, and then the accompanying need to call each other to faithfulness in our distinctive, respective situations. Are you being faithful where you are? You're living on a mountain somewhere. What are you doing with that mountain? You know, that kind of thing. So that's sort of the other side of this global thing, and I don't quite know how to jump from there to the global bit. Who are the actors? Who's going to do that? Are we ready to do that? Are we preparing for that? I don't know. I must say, the impact of the small group of Mennos, CJP, EMU, and so on, has been absolutely remarkable. I mean, we just run into it all the time, all over the place. But we have not yet conquered, for sure. I don't know the answer.
You're supposed to know the answer.
Thank you so much, Harold. I find this so interesting, and I love hearing your stories of what you learned and how you learned to work in Africa. I must admit, I come from a family circle that thinks very differently than I do. And some of you have heard enough to know that that's true. I keep wondering how, I look around us here. We represent a relatively small group of the local Mennonite community. How can we find ways to talk to each other in this community? It's so politicized. And we don't want to believe it, but it is. It comes so fast when you want to even bring up this subject. And I think one of the real challenges is, how do we begin to get conversation going between churches, between groups here? That's my concern.
That's right on there with some things you were saying. Go ahead.
Just the other day, I completed a questionnaire from the Community Mennonite Church where we attend. And the questionnaire was something about, should we leave Virginia Conference or should we stay? Now I read that against the kind of comments I made this morning, and I find that extremely frustrating, I must say. My answer was, don't leave and join a whole bunch of other conferences and keep the conversation going and keep all the contradictions going as well. But don't conclude the argument. Keep it going, always. That's the function of church. The high point there is Acts 15, it seems to me. That's the story of the New Testament. When different groups got together, different cultures, different cosmologies got together, and they agreed on some things and agreed to disagree on others. That is the function of our faith community. And we should keep it alive. Keep all the disagreements alive and all the discussions alive. So I agree with
And I'd just like to say, I would just like to challenge us to keep thinking, how can you begin to get more conversation going outside of the circle that we are in? I must just, here in Parkview Church, there is a very small group of us that have chosen, there are 6 of us, that have chosen to say we want to regularly meet for conversation conversation, and we deliberately recognize there are 3 of us who think very differently from the other 3. And we try to have regular conversations. We haven't changed each other's minds very much, but we know each other in very different ways. And I think we've all said it's worthwhile to do that. That's a very small, but I think, my point is, I think it's going to take deliberate choices for conversation and larger than conversation. Thanks so much, Harold.
Let me just follow up on that real quickly. In Nairobi, we were there in retirement for more than 10 years, 15 years. And during those years, we had a little coffee group. We met every Saturday morning in a coffee shop. There were about 3 of us, 4 of us. And we would invite guest speakers to our coffee. And we would take on projects in our coffee. And we even staged a public seminar on a new book that came out by a church leader. But the other thing that, just to make your point, the other thing we discovered was that after 10 years even of discussion, we were constantly finding out new things about each other that were manifest in discussion. By talking, you find these things out, that even your own ideas become clear as you interact. So keep talking, yeah, absolutely, yeah.